Okay, caring for the poor, whose responsibility is it? Deuteronomy 15:11. As God's people were preparing to enter the promised land, Moses wanted to ensure that they remember the laws that God had given them 40 years earlier when they had first been there but failed to enter. His instructions at this time included those for taking care of the poor, but given all the verdant abundance in the land, it seemed almost unimaginable that there might even be poor among them. After all, on the first excursion into the land, they cut down a branch and a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two men, and reported that the land certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruits. Numbers 13, 23, and 27. Clusters of grapes so large that it took two men just to carry one cluster? How could there be any poor in such a land? But Moses, as a good leader, planned with an eye to the future, reminding the people, "For the poor will never cease to be in the land, therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land." Deuteronomy 15:11. 1,500 years later, the Apostle Paul similarly reported to the church of Galatia that they were to remember the poor. Galatians 2:10. It's a long one. God is and always has been concerned about taking care of the poor. But notice how he wants it done, or rather, who he wants doing it. The command from Deuteronomy was directed at individuals, and the mandate from Galatians was pointed at the church. Neither was directed at the government. In fact, in scores of verses on this subject, the Bible repeatedly and explicitly affirms that the care of the poor is the responsibility of individuals and the congregation, but not of government. Consider some of those verses. The individual. Significantly, the overwhelming majority of scriptures that addresses meeting the needs of the poor are directed at individuals. For example, in Leviticus 25:25, 35, and 39, individuals are pointedly told to identify the poor around them and then help care for them until they get back on their feet. Individuals are also commanded, when you happen on someone who's in trouble or needs help among your people with whom you live in this land that God, your God, is giving you, don't look the other way pretending you don't see him. Don't keep a tight grip on your purse. No. Look at him, open your purse, lend whatever and as much as he needs, give freely and spontaneously. Don't have a stingy heart. The way you handle matters like this triggers God, your God's blessing in everything you do, all your work and ventures. There are always going to be poor and needy people among you, so I command you, always be generous, open purse and hands, give to your neighbors in trouble, your poor and your hurting neighbors. Deuteronomy 15:7-8. 10 and 11, the Message. God also declares that a primary lesson he wants to teach his people through fasting and prayer is for individuals to learn to take responsibility of caring for the poor. Is this not the fast which I choose to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him? And if you give yourself to hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness, your gloom will become like midday. Isaiah 58:6-10. Jesus similarly told his followers, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?' The king will answer and say to them, truly, I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. Matthew 25:34 through 40. The emphasis on both the Old and New Testament is on the individual's responsibility to take care of the poor, not the government's. Numerous other verses addressing the responsibility of individuals to care for the poor include Deuteronomy 24:12, Job 29:12 through 16, Psalm 41:1, Proverbs 14:24, 19:17, 31:20, Matthew 19:21, Mark 10:21, 14:7, Luke 14:3, Luke 14:13 and 14, and 18:22. Congregation. Just as the scriptures direct individuals to care for the poor, so too they direct the church and congregation to do the same. For example, if a poor individual is unable to meet his obligations, the priests were instructed to examine that person, determine the extent of his needs, see what part of them he was capable of paying, and then grant the proportional relief, Leviticus 27:8. Similarly, in Esther 9:22, after God had delivered his people from their enemies, Mordecai wrote them that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending proportions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. This command was to the collective group of God's people. To the Jews who were living in the nation, it was not to government. Under the leadership of the apostles in the early New Testament church, there was not a needy person among them, because the church distributed to each as many as any had need. Acts 4:34 through 35. And when James, Peter, and John were in Jerusalem, they specifically met with Paul and charged him to remember the poor, which Paul reports was the very thing I also was eager to do. Galatians 2:10. As Paul made his subsequent missionary journeys, he proudly reported of the churches he had stated in Macedonia and Achaia that they have been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Romans 15:26. In fact, he specifically noted that they were pleased to do so, and they are indebted to them. Clearly, the church or congregation is directed to help the poor. The government. While the directives of caring for the poor are definitely given to individuals and to the congregation, and any explicit commands given to the government, absolutely yes. Let me read that again. I'm sorry. The government. While directives about caring for the poor are definitely given to individuals and to the congregation, are any explicit commands given to government? Absolutely yes. For example, civil authorities are commanded, "Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. You shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute." Exodus 23:3 and 6. You shall do no justice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great. Leviticus 19:15. If a king judges the poor with truth, his throne will be established forever. Proverbs 29:14. Government is charged to provide justice to the poor and maintain their rights whenever they utilize the civil process, but government is not charged with meeting the material needs. Therefore, to make government the object for helping the poor not only rebels against the jurisdictional lines established by God himself, but also usurps his direct commands to the individual and the congregation. Not surprisingly, statistics affirm the wisdom of the scriptures in this area. Consider information from the American Institute of Philanthropy. in order to help donors maximize the effect of their charitable giving. The AIP rates various charities by calculating the percentage of donated income that actually makes it through its intended target. According to the AIP, a charity's effectiveness is acceptable if 60% of what it collects reaches its intended charitable mission. Donors should avoid contributing to organizations where less than 60% of contributed funds reach the designated target. So what percentage of every dollar collected by the government for the poor actually reaches them? A dismal 30%. The U.S. government is quite possibly the nation's most inefficient mechanism for meeting the needs of the poor. No reasonable donor would fund an organization where only 30 cents out of each dollar reached its target. But many today not only tolerate such malfeasance, but even encourage increased government spending to fight poverty. Why? Just to see 70% of each additional dollar wasted. Biblically, taking care of the poor is to be done by individuals, churches, charities, etc., but not government. The Bible pattern was understood and closely followed in early America. In fact, founding fathers such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson served as vestrymen in their respective churches, and the responsibility of the church vestry included arranging care for the poor in the community. But the fact that the church was to assist the poor in no way relieved individuals of their own personal obligation to do the same. As Thomas Jefferson affirmed, I deem it the duty of every man to devote a certain portion of his income for charitable purposes, and that it is his further duty to see it so applied as to do the most good of which it is capable. This I believe to be the best ensured by keeping within the circle of his own inquiry and information the subjects of distress to whose relief his contributions shall be applied. Notice that Jefferson said that care of the poor should be undertaken by those closest to them. Recall that the biblical directive had been for individuals and priests to examine and determine the needs of the poor in their own community, those nearest around them. Jefferson urges the application of the biblical principle, and Jefferson's own personal charity was very generous, a fact attested to by his private ledger books, and generally his charity for others was done anonymously, just as Jesus had commanded. Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have no reward within your Father who is in heaven. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Matthew 6:1, 3, and 4. There will always be excuses for not helping the poor, and Jefferson had heard many of them in his day. His beloved wife died in 1782, and loving her deeply, even several years afterward, he was still devastated. In 1786, still not recovered from his tragic loss, he was sent by Congress as a diplomat to France. While there, he met a noted painter and artist, Maria Causeway, and they spent time together both in France and America before Jefferson decided she was not to be his wife. Jefferson would frequently see some poor person he wanted to help, but Causeway always gave him reasons why he should not. Jefferson initially listened, but then told her why he never should have heeded her advice. A desire to do what is right has sometimes induced me to conform to your counsels. A few facts, however, which I can readily recall to your memory, will suffice to prove to you that nature has not organized you for our moral direction. When the poor wearied soldier whom we overtook at Chickahominy with his pack on his back begged us to let him get up behind our chariot carriage, you began to calculate that the road was full of soldiers, and that if all should be taken up, our horses would fail in their journey. We drove on, therefore, but soon becoming sensible you had made me do wrong, that though we cannot relieve all the distressed, we should relieve as many as we can. I turned about to take up the soldier, but he had entered a bypath and was no more to be found. And from that moment to this, I could never find him out to ask his forgiveness. Again, when the poor woman came to ask a charity in Philadelphia, you whispered that she looked like a drunkard and that $50 was enough to give her for the alehouse. Those who want the dispositions, who lack the resolve to give, easily find reasons why they ought not give. When I sought her out afterwards and did what I should have done at first, you know that she employed the money immediately towards placing her child at school. If our country, when pressed with wrongs at the point of the bayonet, had been governed by its head instead of its hearts, where should we have been now? Hanging on the gallows as high as Haman's. Esther 7:10. George Washington also felt a personal responsibility, as every Christian should, to help the poor. When he was called away from Mount Vernon to serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, he directed his business manager, "Let the hospitality of the house with the respect to the poor be kept up. Let no one go hungry away. If any of this kind of people should be in want of corn, supply their necessities, provided it does not encourage them in idleness, and I have no objection to your giving my money in charity." What I mean by having no objection is that it is my desire that it should be done. But Washington not only provided for the poor, he encouraged others also to be generous in helping them. Let your heart feel for the affliction and distress of everyone. Let your hands give in proportion to your purse. Remember always the estimation of the widow's mite. Luke 21:2-3. Never let an indignant person ask without receiving something. If you have the means, always recollecting in what light the widow's mite was viewed. Luke 21:2-3. Benjamin Franklin likewise helped those in need, and he viewed his gifts as if he were planting a seed that might sprout and multiply. Thus, when he helped someone, he was asking them that when they were back on their feet to also do the same for others, as he told one such recipient of his kindness. Sometime or other you may have an opportunity of assisting with an equal sum a stranger who has equal need of it. Do so. By that means you will discharge any obligation you may suppose yourself under to me, and join him to do the same on occasion. By pursuing such a practice, much good may be done with little money. Mankind are all of a family. God wants the poor to be taken care of, but he has made very clear that doing so is the responsibility of individuals and the church, not the government. That's it.